And then just to let you know, we are so excited to have this opportunity to collaborate with Illinois Humanities and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for this very timely discussion. I feel like everywhere I go, people are trying to figure out if we should be excited about the Star Trek-like future, where like data and computer are always very helpful, or if it's time for us to start building up our defenses so that we don't end up with the life of the folks in Terminator or Matrix, right? And so like, which is it? Where are we headed? I know it's on all of our minds. And I can't think of better partners with whom to explore these topics. And now, my third job, and then I'll get out of your way, is to introduce the Executive Director of the Illinois Humanities Institute, Illinois Humanities, not Institute, my dear friend Angelis Aguirre, who might give you a more learned overview of what's in store for you tonight. Okay, enjoy.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Angelis Aguirre. I'm the Executive Director of Illinois Humanities. And a little over a year ago, I read Don DeLillo's novel, Zero K. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read that novel, but in the novel, the bodies of dying, really, really wealthy people are being stored, as are their brains, for a time when the earth has been decimated by war or some kind of natural catastrophe. And once the whole earth has been decimated, then the bodies and the minds of all these really wealthy people will then be brought back to life, and they'll live forever. And Don DeLillo asks some really interesting questions in the novel. One is, once we develop the technology to beat death, who will get to live forever? And how will we decide who gets to live forever? And then as a humanist, an equally interesting question for me is, how would human consciousness change if death no longer existed, when the whole notion of being human relies on our understanding that we all die? These weren't just fascinating questions in a piece of fiction, but I was astounded to learn not much later that our technology is leading us in this direction faster than any of us would imagine. The mission of Illinois Humanities is to fuel inquiry and conversation about the most important issues facing society. One of those issues is artificial intelligence, where science and technology are progressing at breakneck speeds. During such times, we believe that it's important to stop and take stock and ask, what direction do we choose to go in? Because artists have been addressing the complexity of artificial intelligence for decades, I can think of no better partner than the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where their own faculty have done great groundbreaking work on this topic. And of course, there's not a better place for acquiring knowledge and circulating information than the public library. So we're thrilled to partner with the School of the Art Institute and the Chicago Public Library on this program tonight. This evening's discussion was designed to offer an introduction to artificial intelligence, both in terms of science and technology and the fascinating web of ethical issues that arise along with these advances. Our hope is that this conversation will serve as a spark for a larger and longer conversation about what direction we choose. Thanks very much for being with us. And now I'd like to welcome Elissa Tenney. Elissa is the president of the School of the Art Institute. She's the first president of the college. She had served as provost before becoming the president. And thank you, Elissa, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Anel. Thank you, Andrea and Angel. The School of the Art Institute of Chicago is thrilled to be partnering with the library and with Illinois Humanities in sponsoring tonight's event. Discussions such as this exemplify SAIC's longstanding focus on the intersection of art and science, a focus that was greatly expanded under the leadership of Chancellor and former President Walter Massey, who unfortunately could not be with us tonight. As Angel mentioned, SAIC faculty have long been trailblazers in art and science collaborations. Back in the 1960s, Sonia Sheridan experimented with new ways of making and altering images through early xerographic technology. In the late 90s, Professor Eduardo Katz coined the term bioart, and earlier this year, he realized a sculpture on the International Space Station by communicating with astronauts who were in orbit. This tradition continues with the work of faculty member Heather Dewey-Hagborg, lifelike masks that are reconstructed from discarded DNA drawn from chewing gum and cigarette butts. Artists, after all. The current association between art and science should not be surprising. From ancient visual thinkers like Euclid to titans of early modernity like Leonardo da Vinci, art and design perform a symbiotic dance with science and technology that shows what the future might be and reveals how we might get there. In the field of artificial intelligence, that art and technology pas de deux has become especially charged. Today, we live in a world where technology can realize our dreams, or so we think. Smart electronics can answer complex problems, differentiate among faces, interpret human speech, and win nationally syndicated quiz shows. Nevertheless, both the artistic visions and the scientific inventions suggest both good and bad outcomes. You'd be okay with the Jetsons' robo-homemaker Rosie, but flee from the murderous Hal of 2001. Amazon's Echo may be able to play music anywhere in your house while answering trivia questions, but are you sure it isn't sending vital data to identity thieves? Even scientists and entrepreneurs are divided on AI. Ray Kurzweil and Mark Zuckerberg embrace the promise of discovery and convenience. Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk warn of irreversible doom. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the AI ethics tug-of-war is how, in practice, the vanguard of artificial intelligence recedes from us. When judgments that were once the jurisdiction of the human mind can be made by your television set, what was once the territory of science fiction becomes mundane. Artificial intelligence, meanwhile, asks more ambitious questions. Can robots feel? Are we really going to live forever? I can think of no better guide to these thorny philosophical issues than tonight's moderator, Raja El-Halwani. Sorry, Raja. Raja is a professor in the Department of Liberal Arts at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, the author of numerous books and essays that center on ethics, particularly the ethics in the realms of love, desire, and sex, as well as the philosophy of art and political philosophy. Please join me in welcoming Raja.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. Thank you, President Tenney, for your nice remarks. I am Raja Halwani, the moderator of the panel tonight, and I will introduce the fellow panelists in a minute. But the way this is going to proceed is that after I introduce them, I will say a few remarks about artificial intelligence and to contextualize the issues. And then we have about 7 questions that one or more than one of the panelists will be answering. So after I finish my remarks, I will ask the first question, and then after we finish answering it, we will go to the next one. At 7, we will have Q&A, and at 7, I will probably direct you of how to go about asking a question if you need to do so. So my fellow panelists, beginning with all my way to the right, is Christoph Ringer, who is a faculty member at the Theological Seminary. And then after that is Malcolm McIver, who is a neuroscientist and a roboticist at Northwestern University. Sitting next to him is Rachel Bronson, who is the executive director and publisher of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And last but not least is Pete Beckman, who is a senior fellow at Argonne National Laboratory. So I'm going to speak for about a minute or a minute and a half to contextualize the discussion, and then we will move to the very first question. I'm a little bit nervous. There are so many people in this room. Okay. I feel better now that I joked. Anyway, we are having this panel tonight because technology and artificial intelligence are advancing very fast. And some people are alarmed, or at the very least, wish to think through more where all this progress might take us. Consider that almost every major company has either started or is thinking about starting to use robots or robotic machinery to perform certain tasks. One company has started using robots to make pizza, apparently, although it's still in its early stages. And Uber is experimenting with self-driving taxis. And here, consider the irony of how this will affect Uber drivers who find driving Uber cars to be an easy way to make extra money. Amazon Go is planning supermarkets that do not use cashiers. What you buy will be detected by sensors, after which you get billed. Of course, our technology is pervasive now in the military, with the use of drones being foremost in people's minds when they worry about such technology. What are some of the concerns that these advancements might raise? Most obviously, they are ethical and practical. For example, what will happen to people's ability to find jobs if they are replaced by automation or by robots? Although historically speaking, people have been able to, with time, to change types of jobs, both individually and as economic groups, some worry that this might not be as easy this time around because the technology is going to be pervasive throughout the economy. Another issue to think about is what will happen to equality among people when it is likely that those who are rich and in powerful position might continue to be so as poorer people lose jobs and are not able to have equal access to such technology. And thirdly, as we all know, having a job is not just about having an income, it is also about having meaning in one's life. Loss of a job can mean loss of purpose to many people. In war, to give a last example, would the ability to kill from a distance make killing any easier? And how would it affect the killer's humanity, basically? Artificial intelligence also raises some fascinating questions that are more metaphysical than ethical in nature, though clearly the two are also connected to each other. What would these creatures be if they were to be incredibly advanced? What is their status? Are they persons? If no, they must be some sort of a new entity, given that they are neither non-human animals nor regular objects like sofas and bookshelves. And if they become closer and closer to being persons, does that mean we have to connect with them as we connect with other people? Can we do certain things to them that we don't allow ourselves to do to other human beings, such as objectifying them as we objectify most animals and sometimes human beings? In any case, just a final point, artificial intelligence is obviously not good or bad in itself. Which it is up to us, depending on how we decide to use it. If we invent robots that can kill people with chemical gas, that is our fault. And if we come up with machines that can predict the existence of cancer and preempt it, that is praise for us. Ultimately, I think, whether artificial intelligence harms or benefits us and the world we inhabit is up to us. It is we who can make public policy regarding their use, hence the reason we are here, to have a rich conversation that might move us to do something before these potentially evil machines beat us to it. Thank you. So that was a joke also at the end, but that's it. All right, so our first question for tonight is, what is AI? We wanted to have a basic definition of what AI is so that we can all be on the same page. And Pete Beckman will be, Pete will be answering that question.
So hello. So we're going to do a very quick explanation of how we got from the beginning bits of what people refer to as sort of calculating. For centuries, we've been using calculating devices, the abacus, slide rule. IBM made calculating machines, but these are not really computers. They're just tabulators. They're ways to add numbers together. It wasn't until really in 1936, Alan Turing, someone up in the top left corner there that you may be familiar with, that he coined this concept, this idea that there is a computing device, a computing engine, a symbolic processor that's different than just adding numbers. And in World War II, Alan was known for breaking the Enigma machine, a code breaker. And in the 40s, people started to build on these concepts computers. And universities and laboratories were building computers. And by 1953, Argonne National Laboratory had built a computer called Avodac. For a while, all of these were ACs, ENIAC and Maniac and others. And eventually, people started wondering, can they think? Or if we keep making them big enough, maybe they can think. And again, Alan Turing stepped in and said, well, we need to think about a test. And he proposed a concept that if you had a conversation with a computer and it could convince you that it was intelligent, that it was a human, that it passed the test. And we now refer to that as the Turing test. And of course, there are faults with this because it doesn't require that you get the right answer. You can convince someone that you're intelligent even if you give the wrong answer, and alternate facts, notwithstanding. So this is a problem with the Turing test, but we immediately started building computers, and you can see the chess player up on the right, Garry Kasparov. We sort of idolized the intelligence of the chess player, and then in 1997, IBM beat it with a machine called Deep Blue. And then, of course, Watson. We still have trivia and understanding human speech, and then that falls. And now we have Go, the Chinese game Go, which has recently fallen to a computer being able to beat the best human, and of course self-driving cars. So here we are with what is our world and how many of these ideas that we think maybe are related to AI are we losing. So at the next slide here, we later, von Neumann introduced this concept of a technology singularity, a point where there's such acceleration that we can't even see past it. And Werner Vinge said, well, it's the super intelligence. That's what's going to happen at that singularity. And so that's why we're here today, this idea of machine intelligence, artificial intelligence, and where will it lead us? Will we be cared for by the artificial intelligence? Will it be helpful? Or will we be in conflict? And I think that's our question.
Thank you, Pete. Our next question is, what potential effects will artificial intelligence have on the economy, equality, and the environment? And, sorry, I made a mistake. How will artificial intelligence redefine the human identity? What is a person in the context of artificial intelligence? And Christoph Ringer and Pete Beckman will be answering this question. Christoph, you want to go?
Thank you. So, two of the perennial questions that human beings tend to ask ourselves. And the first is, who am I? And all of us are very familiar with the many ways in which we confer meaning on who we are, our sense of self, our relationships with the social world. But the other question is, what am I? What kind of capacities does the human have? What are my potentials? What are my desires? What is it that marks me as somehow being different from all of the other entities that I interact with in the world? And for hundreds of years, we have been attempting to pinpoint something unique about what it means to be human. And as many of our panelists would tell you, it seems as if the line keeps moving. It seems as if whenever we have identified something that marks us as extraordinarily intelligent, right, we can set ourselves apart from the rest of creation, AI now comes along and threatens that boundary. And I want to suggest just a couple of areas that I think are going to be important in thinking about artificial intelligence and the question of identity. The first is self-knowledge. We are producing massive amounts of data right now that we have never produced at any time in history. Every time you like something on Facebook, every time you post a comment, your phone is generating extraordinary amounts of data about who you are. The connection between big data and artificial intelligence, and the possibility of devices that might interact with my body or my brain, threatens to fundamentally transform self-knowledge. And with the transformation of self-knowledge, we also begin to see a shift in how we understand issues of the moral life. Oftentimes, moral culpability, what I can be responsible for as a moral agent, is often framed in two ways. One relates to the will, and the other one to knowledge. Did I know that person was standing behind me when I backed up? And am I culpable for that? Is it possible that AI can deliver to us forms of knowledge where we will then be morally culpable for things that previously we could not have imagined? So self-knowledge, I think, will be one huge area that AI might transform. The other is our experience of embodiment. And by embodiment, I simply mean this: the experience of my body as mine. if there are ways in which machines can begin to interact with our bodies, our very sense of self is transformed. As human beings, the very things that we create often become that which sustains our existence. So human beings were always creating what we call artifacts, artifice, human culture. And the very things that we create ultimately come to condition who we are. I would want to argue that AI is another threshold, right? That this is a technology that we are creating, and it will then come to condition who we are and how we think about ourselves.
Thank you, Crystal. Pete? So at Argonne National Laboratory, we have a supercomputer that's one of the world's fastest supercomputers. And if all of the 7.5 billion people on the planet could do math, 1 million math operations per second, everyone on the planet doing 1 million math operations per second, it still wouldn't be as fast as the computer. But we're not threatened by that. We think of it as a computing device. It isn't until we start to move to this idea that they're thinking that somehow we become quite nervous. French philosopher René Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," right? Our identity is that we think, calculating. Oh, a machine can calculate, but thinking is different. René also said, animals are mere machines, but man stands alone. And so one of the problems we have is that as we move toward AI, and for us, as we look toward super intelligence, what questions do we yield, that's part of our identity, do we yield to AI? Certainly if I have a science question, I have no problem yielding that to my super intelligent being, right? My super intelligence, I could ask for the best cancer treatment. I could ask, and even though there's judgment involved, I can ask those questions. Well, does that mean I should also ask moral questions? Should I ask ethics questions? If it's super intelligent, what part of me is left? What questions do I still get to answer, and what do I cede to the machine? And so I think that these questions of identity revolve around these questions of what we can ask and what we can build and how we interact with that.
Thank you, Pete. Our next question is, what potential effects will artificial intelligence have on the economy, equality, and the environment? And Malcolm McIver and Christopher Ringer will be answering this question. Malcolm?
Yeah, if I could have the first slide. So in this image from a movie from about a decade ago, the creators of the film prefigure a utopia of us sitting in our Barca loungers at Low G, Skyping to our friends a foot away from us. Presumably by this point, we're all on the universal basic income as well, although Wally didn't comment on that. But there's a lot of discussion in the media, I'm sure you're aware, of what exactly is going to be the impact of AI, and there's two voices I'd like to represent. The voice of the AI entrepreneur, and the consensus amongst them seems to be that the number of jobs at threat is a lot higher than government and society is currently considering. And then there's the voice of labor economists and historians who are basically saying we've seen this movie before, and it's happened with agriculture, it's happened with ATMs, it's happened with weaving, it's happened again and again and again, and where machines take over a whole sector of the economy, and those people somehow find jobs. Like a century ago, if you told a person a century ago that a whole bunch of people would be employed in the video game industry, they would have looked at you with a blank stare, right? So if I could get the next slide, there's a bunch of categories of effort represented here. On the right-hand side are millions of people employed in the US marketplace for each category of effort. And at the top there you see non-routine cognitive. That's things like judges, lawyers, code writers, there's lots of categories there. This is highly resistant to AI because it's very diverse effort, and it's very hard to get an algorithm to do something so diverse. But the routine cognitive and the routine manual are both being eaten away by two different stripes of machine. The routine manual is being eaten away by everyday robots that aren't very smart but can do a lot of work. And then the routine cognitive, this is where AI is really having impact and will have a great deal of impact in the future, and that is things like reading an X-ray, reading an MRI. Even you could consider, other than, in sunny California, driving is basically routine manual, but in Boston in the rain or in Chicago in the ice, it's routine cognitive, not routine manual. So these distinctions are a little bit fuzzy at times too, and also depend on where we are with the algorithms. And then at the bottom we have non-routine manual, things like landscaping, highly resistant to automation as well. So this figure at a glance sort of tells you the ways in which both the labor economists and the AI entrepreneurs are correct. So the AI entrepreneurs are saying there's going to be a whole lot of dislocation, and that seems to be true. And the labor economists are saying, well, that dislocation may be temporary, and eventually we'll find new forms of human endeavor. And that seems historically to always be true. But so that's where we are currently. Are there any other comments I wanted to make on this? Right. No, I think that's good.
Thank you, Malcolm. Christoph?
I want to talk a little bit about some of the conversations that are happening as it relates to the relationship between AI and democracy. Increasingly, AI will have a huge impact on the kinds of decisions that are made in everyday life, whether it is, as you mentioned, medical treatments, applying for loans. So much of social life may be influenced by AI, and the question becomes, if we do not understand the algorithms guiding these decisions, how then do we hold them accountable? How do we know that these algorithms have not just picked up on the consequences of various forms of prejudice and discrimination that have accumulated over many years? Right? How will we hold AI accountable is a huge concern. Another concern is the way in which AI contributes to what many call liberal paternalism or a paternalistic government, where politics is using algorithms to feed you news, and we're already familiar with this. We're living with this. The concern is that there is going to be an increasing polarization and an erosion of social knowledge, collective wisdom, and how we understand one another. There are conversations regarding a new social contract, right, in which democracy has to take into account these issues of technology all the way down. So some of the conversations are, should we have a right to a digital copy of all the data that has been collected on me, and how that data has been used to make decisions, whether it is about insurance, right, or college applications, loans, et cetera. So we're moving into a phase where the idea of the digital citizen, right, is going to be extremely important. And many people are concerned that we are at a precipice of either democracy 2.0 or feudalism 2.0, where the wealthy and the applications of AI are being driven by capital investments. Right? So you'll see a huge disparity in how AI is being used. Right? Again, thinking about how will this augment our capacities, and what effect will that have in a society that is hyper-competitive? Right? So those are some of the challenges to democratic life from artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Christoph. And this leads us to the next question, which is how will we assign blame or praise when an artificial intelligence machine makes a mistake or does something good as a result of its machine learning? How would we respond ethically to AI and in different cultural, religious contexts, no less? And Pete, will be addressing this question.
So we don't yet have what many people refer to as general AI that can cover so many topics. We have things that are good at certain things, like reading a radiology report. So how does that happen? How do computers learn? Let me first very briefly explain. You hear this term deep learning or machine learning. The way this works is that the computer is presented with thousands or millions of pieces of data, and they're correlated, and the machine builds up a pattern, a way in which it can then derive cat or dog, right? So on pictures from the internet, you can imagine millions of pictures of cats and dogs, and an algorithm, a deep learning framework, then being able to eventually discriminate A or B, cancer or not, I should stop earlier or not when driving the car. So this is all based on the training data. So this then causes us to be concerned about how we assign blame. We have a notion in our society of reasonable care. Whether I'm negligent or whether I'm to blame, did I do what everyone could expect? When it comes to artificial intelligence, we don't have an algorithm written down that says this is how I should respond. It is a set of training data that has been built up. Now, we have to augment that, and this is where now life becomes complicated with respect to ethics, is we need to augment that with what we believe to be noble or true. So if we want people to be treated equally, even if the data suggests that this people group and this people group are quite different with risk, so whether it is socioeconomic, whether it's male or female, whether it's ex-con or not, if we hold things to be true and noble, that we don't want, even if the data represents something and we can draw a conclusion from it, that we want that ethical nobility built in, that's something that we don't have yet. We haven't built or written down what that should look like. And there's religious contexts behind this too, with respect to treatment for medical conditions, where we want that respected and programmed in. Now, if we look at how we build these things, we also have to look at how we treat them. So let's pull up an example here. So in the top left-hand corner is a set of Amazon robots, and they're orange, and they move around shipping, cases, right? To move around parts, and they're scurrying around the floor there. They look very unimaginative. And of course, on the right now is a robot made in Japan, made by AIST, and this robot is designed to be sort of an average-shaped Japanese woman in the sort of 19, 20 years old. Now, if I'm frustrated at my job and I boot and I kick one of those orange robots at Amazon, do I feel bad about that? Probably not. If I do the same to the robot on the right, have I possibly fooled myself into believing that I've done something wrong? Is it really different because it's simply in a different shape? In fact, the facial features are derived from manga characters. They have big eyes and a small nose, purposefully pulling us into is that really alive? So we have this problem here that we are building AI to trick us, to make us feel more attached than actually possibly the task calls for. And so certainly this draws to question how we reward, and if we need to reward, do we need to say thank you to the robot on the right? We don't thank the orange Amazon robot. And blame with respect to cars and accidents are the same fashion. Humans have as part of our identity pain, a short lifespan, and death. That's part of us. And so one question is, while we design robots and AI with silicon, can those concepts of pain and death and finite time apply? And if they don't apply, my feeling is maybe there are no rights here, that I do not need to impart rights. And I think that's a question that society will be asking is, since we have this capability to make and remake and save state and the life is forever, maybe that's different fundamentally than my life.
Thank you, Pete. The next question is, how will artists not only interpret the AI phenomenon, but also have a direct impact on its development? And Malcolm is going to address that question.
Yeah, so I worked at the interface of science and art in two different ways. One is as a creator, and for that, this slide is a little bit of a detail on that. This is a piece called Scale, which I did with Marlena Novak and J. Allen Yim, both artists. And in this piece, well, actually, we have a clip of video I think explains it better than I can.
Scale is an interactive installation that features 12 electric knife fish from the Amazon River. The fish comprise a choir made up of 12 different species. Each fish produces a constant electric field, and each species has its own characteristic frequency. They use their fields to detect their surroundings and their prey while hunting. Those fields are picked up by custom-built sensors and then amplified. The signals are then routed, so each fish is given its own channel and speaker for a spatialized sound experience. Arrays of LEDs under each tank provide visual feedback.
These sonified electrical fields provide the source tones for an immersive audiovisual environment. Participants act as producers using a touchscreen interface. Each interactor can cue an individual fish or combine the sounds of several fish together.
Yeah, so that was Scale. Part of the reason I wanted to do this piece was when I tell people that I work professionally as a scientist working on electric fish brains, they'll often ask me, well, does that come with batteries, or do you plug that in? So I wanted to more of the world to know about these amazing creatures. The other way in which I work at this interface between art and science is as a consultant for science fiction films out of Hollywood and TV series. So I've worked on Terminator Genesis, I've worked on The Avengers, I've worked on Tron Legacy, a few others, and a prequel of Battlestar Galactica, Caprica, which some of you might know, unfortunately canceled. But what was fascinating working in this interface, and I think getting to the question, is the fluidity with which ideation occurs between art and science and engineering. And that fluidity is pretty well known. It goes back a very long way. The submarine goes to Jules Verne. The helicopter was inspired by another book of Jules Verne's. The atomic power was inspired by one of H.G. Wells's books. The physicist who thought through how to get the chain reaction going read that book and got inspired to solve the problem. The inventor of the rocket was inspired by War of the Worlds. So it goes on and on: cell phones, satellites, Arthur C. Clarke, et cetera. So I think really the question is, why is there this revolving door between the imagination of artists and what scientists and engineers eventually produce? I don't really know the answer, but I think part of it has to do with the source of human motivation. I mean, without motivation and inspiration, why would a scientist or an engineer do any work, right? And as for you, so what was the source of inspiration? When I was working out at Caltech, I interfaced a lot with people at JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab, and they were, without exception, Star Wars nerds, big fans of Star Trek. These people live on that mythology, and it inspired them to get into those fields. So as a final note on this, France has this great art roboticist, Francois Delarosière, who wrote that dreams are what fuel the greatest human adventures. So artists are masters of that realm. So I expect we will continue to see them leading humanity into the next great adventures to come, be they AI or in other directions.
Thank you, Malcolm. The next question is, will artificial intelligence give us different images of God or different religions or ethical structures? And Christoph will address this question.
Thank you. When you look historically, you'll find something interesting. Major advances in science and technology often lead people to think that religion is going to fade away. Turns out that religion is pretty durable, for better or for worse. And you can laugh at that, by the way. So I would argue that religion is very human. I would argue that we are hardwired for the experience of transcendence, the experience of awe, to wonder, and even maybe to worship. And what's interesting, when you look at AI, there are very deep religious aspects to it. When you listen to some of the figures within the conversation, there is a deep hope that is strikingly familiar to the history of Christian thought. There is a sense in which one of the consequences or legacies of monotheistic religions is the idea that history itself is meaningful and that it has an inherent goal. It is going somewhere. And so when you hear the language of singularity, there's this sense that we are inevitably moving towards a point, a kind of apocalyptic moment, where there will be this disclosure and everything will be changed. Right? Many of the conversations in religion fall around the relationship of artificial intelligence to what we call transhumanism. Right? The idea that we can fundamentally transform who we are, maybe even finally escape the limits of the body. Right? So one of the interesting things about the Christian tradition in particular is that it has a God that actually comes into human reality to transform it. Now, various Christian traditions will debate whether or not human nature can fundamentally be changed, to what extent it can be changed, but they all agree that it should be improved. And part of where many of the religious debates are now is, do we see human life as a gift, which includes mortality, which includes our creatureliness, and should we then be stewards of that gift? Or should we understand that our creativity, our capacity to create and to generate knowledge and improve is also a gift? And how do you manage these two inheritances? I also want to suggest that what has not been thought a lot about by many theologians is that it is not just a theological interpretation of AI, but AI is going to fundamentally transform our experience of religion as such. Religion has always been in conversation and been changed by technological advances. For example, I could imagine an Alexa, right? Maybe Alexa is ordained, and Alexa can answer certain kinds of religious questions depending on how I identify. Right? Imagine thousands of years of religious texts, right, being assimilated and having AI to interpret those texts. Right? So I think the implications for religion are enormous. We can also rest assured that this will generate new forms of religious piety and religious devotion. I could easily imagine people gathering in a sacred space, and instead of worrying whether or not the rabbi or the minister has a decent message for today, maybe, just maybe, they'll listen to an artificial intelligence, right, deliver something of a message, one that will engender awe and wonder and possibly even loyalties. And we should also be careful to think about the ways in which human beings, religious leaders, may also attempt to use AI in order to further their vision of what it means to be moral, what it means to be human, and what it means to be in a relationship with God. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. The next question is, what impact will artificial intelligence have on national security and international relations? And Rachel Bronson and Pete will be addressing that question. Rachel, if you'd like to start.
Great, thank you. I want to, before I jump in, I just want to also help the audience and come back to something Pete said. is something profoundly different has happened over the last 10 years or so. And so if it feels like these conversations are different and somewhat new, it's because they are. It wasn't until about 2005 where we really had breakthroughs in deep learning. And so there is a continuum, we were talking about this before, of in some sense we can think about artificial intelligence in some ways as an aspect of automation, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the ability of machines to learn from their own experience, to learn from, as Pete said, thousands if not millions of interactions, and therefore begin to make judgments, if you will, about the environment or the context that they're in. And that's a complete game changer when it comes to artificial intelligence. And those breakthroughs really happened only a decade or so ago. So it's built on, as Pete was saying in the beginning, kind of foundations of decades, but we're really in a very interesting, newish kind of world and grappling with what the effects of those learnings are, and then back to Descartes and others, what it means to be human. If it's to think and suddenly machines are thinking, well, kind of where's that difference between the machine and us? And so how that begins to play itself out in national security, there's been a very real focus, because a lot of the kind of technological developments originally used to come out of labs and things like that, of thinking about, well, what does this mean for warfare? How far can we go? Where are the limits of what we should be pushing? What happens if the other guy has it and we don't? And all of those big questions that begin to lay out the frameworks of a new arms race. And to think about, before we enter into national arms races around machines that learn and make decisions on our behalf, what kind of norms or rules must we create and establish before we get to the precipice? So these conversations must happen now, and happily are happening now, and that to me is in part the importance of us being here to begin to think through it. At the very beginning, I think it was the president of SAIC, but it might have been someone else, was talking about Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk, who have really identified kind of artificial intelligence as kind of a third revolution of warfare, and that the artificial intelligence ability to destroy kind of life on Earth as we know it, if you will. And they'll point to gunpowder as the first revolution, nuclear weapons as the second, and artificial intelligence as the third, given what they see in terms of what the technology can create. And so when Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk get together and issue kind of a statement like that, as they did just a couple years ago, again, everyone takes note. So what I thought in terms of this discussion, I would just very quickly lay out kind of two sides, two pieces of AI and how it's being debated by scientists and the national security experts. One is this ability, the ability of what kind of human interaction must we have built in to weapon systems. So the Department of Defense, as you wouldn't be surprised, has kind of something that frames what they think about it. And so for DOD and others, they've come up with that in terms of weaponry and strategies. We need to exercise appropriate levels of human judgment over the use of force. So it's not just drones. Often we'll think about drones. Drones are really automation, right? You can plug it in, people put in the targets, send the drones, but the humans still have control over that and can often call them back should they choose. But the human interaction is, if there's under these conditions, go destroy that village, and the wind changes and you can still learn, and where's the human engagement? And so for the Defense Department, in a general sense of there must be human interaction and human judgment around a kill, no kill decision, as horrible as that is to say. But that kind of bounds it, that machines kind of can't take over the full system of that we need to have humans in there. You can sit back and see whether or not you think that makes a whole lot of sense. We certainly know cases from war where humans made terrible decisions because they're so overwhelmed by the panic and the horror of what's happening, and they're misjudging a situation. And in fact, they react much more violently than maybe they were originally programmed to respond. So I think it's worth stepping back to think about, how we feel about that. But that is right now kind of a guiding principle in terms of how far can you let automation run forward. Now, where Stephen Hawking And Elon Musk and others and hundreds of scientists who have signed on to this kind of concern about it, their real concern, what they can see in terms of this machine learning, is the beginning to program, if you will, for certain traits, certain racial features, certain ethnic features, certain identities and behaviors that you build in over time and say, go, kind of seek out that population, the ability for then robots to begin to do that if we let the horrors of that kind of escalate. So those are some of the concerns. There are also some of the frameworks that are beginning to emerge, and do we need a Geneva Convention around artificial intelligence, and what would that look like? So that's kind of one set around the weaponry and human engagement that kind of bounds one part of the very serious conversations that are happening at the United Nations as well as other capitals. I almost find the other side of this discussion even more interesting, and this is, we have a board of science and security experts. We talk about some of these issues, and this is kind of a set conversation, but what some of the physicists and leading thinkers on this are beginning to think about is that's not even their greatest concern. What their greatest concern is what your slide looked at, is so many people begin to lose jobs. At low skill and high skill, right, the sense used to be, well, if you could get people off the fields, they could use their creative genius to create the next whatever. But if now creating that next whatever is also in the province of artificial intelligence, and those people who created the next whatever no longer have jobs, what happens when you have a lot of skilled, unemployed people hanging around? And we know that doesn't tend to end up particularly well either. And so it's interesting to me, this debate of the first kind of set of conversations that I laid out, but actually for national security experts to think about, where are those jobs going to come from? And are we training in our kind of reveling in science and technology? Are we training the next generation out of a job? What jobs really are needed? Do you really need hairstylists more than you need anything else to ensure that there's employment, to ensure that we continue in stable societies and don't end up in this series of conflicts and that we know happen unemployment? So I went on for much too long, but I've been waiting for that question, so I hope you'll indulge me on that.
Thank you, Rachel. And Pete's next.
So one of the issues with AI is that you need to give it priorities. And it means that you have to be able to set what is the value of something, your occupant, your country, versus the value of other things. And where should I draw that line? Right now, humans do that with respect to war and what kind of collateral damage is acceptable. But for artificial intelligence, that decision isn't just about national security. It also happens in what will happen with cars. Mercedes has already come out and said, made a statement earlier this year or end of last year, that they would prioritize their autonomous vehicles for the safety of the occupant if there's ever a priority change, a difference, an accident where a pedestrian or another car comes in, right? So when you have that device, you say, I am more important than the pedestrian or the other car. And in warfare, we have those humans who are making those very difficult value decisions about the cost of something, but yet we have devices which make it possible for us to send autonomous missiles to identify what a tank looks like, or stay afloat in the air for hours waiting for something to happen and then take action. And so that value system is what now currently we're trying to keep a human on, but it is a very slippery endeavor. It is every little tick in our ability to use AI removes the human one step further away from having their hands in that space.
Thank you, Pete. We're almost out of time, and we have one more question. And the question will be addressed by Malcolm and Rachel. So please keep in mind, though, we're almost running out of time. And the question is, what are the potential benefits of artificial intelligence?
The good news for the end.
So that slide I showed you, what's that threat? There's the routine manual and the routine cognitive. Both of those are at threat. AI specifically targets the routine cognitive, and that's things like reading x-rays, reading MRIs, doing things like discovery in legal processes where you're having to do a bunch of research on case precedent. AI is eating away at that. There's very little data on where exactly that's going in terms of benefit to society, shall we say, but it is clear that the most recent analysis of how machine learning systems do versus humans in capturing things like tumors in radiology images is that the deep learning systems do better. And so, and there's a lot of medical errors, as probably many of you know. There's tremendous numbers of medical errors that happen because of tired doctors and tired nurses, which, if automated, if sufficiently routine, could be eliminated with AI. So this is definitely a realm of positive benefit. Rachel mentioned this fact that in war, humans are highly stressed and make a lot of errors. So I totally agree with her that this is possibly another realm that should be reconsidered in terms of keeping humans in the loop with that kill, no kill decision. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Malcolm. Rachel?
Well, I think it's important that we end on this because there's so much benefit that science and technology, in particular around artificial intelligence, will bring us. And on a really small level, I'll just share a story. I was at a panel in Arizona where we were talking about all the challenges of AI and economic systems and some of the security issues we were talking about. It was really bleak and terrible. And in the midst of that, my phone, which I wasn't supposed to be looking at, went off. So of course I looked at it, and it was American Express calling me that someone had my credit card number. So some very smart machine was out there running big data to realize that some patterns didn't look like mine, and it seemed like someone, and so I got this very protective call that was very immediate in the midst of, thinking about the hypothetical. So I think we could all, have examples, and we all believe and understand the potential of what's coming in terms of ability to lengthen lifespans, the ability to bring people out of poverty, and all of those positive issues. Where I just come down on it is it's really important to think about the risks that we've been talking about on the panel, because if we can manage those, risks, the potential for science and technology, artificial intelligence to benefit all of us are really extreme. But what we know is if we don't, there's always, of course, this underside. So just back to kind of national security, where I spend most of my time thinking, the ability to send a robot in to defuse a bomb is tremendous. The ability to manage kind of very chaotic situations, to send a robot in to try to address broken infrastructure, to try to cap leaky problems. The Fukushima disaster, we sent robots in to try to continue to understand what's going on under that by the water of that nuclear power plant. So robots and artificial intelligence are going to bring huge benefits, and we see that all the time. It's just important that we think about the risks, not only the risks, but we think about them so that we get ahead of thinking about some of these issues.
Thank you, Rachel. Before we move to the Q&A, if you could join me in a quick thank you for the panelists. And we have set up a microphone right there, so if you can manage it, if you'd like to ask a question, to come up and speak your question into the microphone. And because we have little time for Q&A, I would ask if you could keep your question as short as possible. And if there is a specific panelist that you have in mind that you would like to answer the question, please do so also, because that would save some time too. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very enlightening. I was very interested to know is that when you talked about the jobs and the shift in the economy for individuals being replaced by technology who are doing cognitive, repetitive jobs. I work in digital marketing, and I see this from the marketing side, is that as people get older in our society, their ability to shift gears into technology is not always doable. And I am concerned that when I see this going on is that they are put to the side, there's not able to be retrained quickly and not able to participate in society. So the next generation comes up behind them, capable, able to learn, able to adapt, but the other generation is put out to pasture.
Yeah, so this is, I think, the central issue, and it's this intersection where the two camps agree, the AI entrepreneurs and the labor economists agree, is that there's going to be a lot of dislocation. And in the past, when we look at where dislocation occurs due to offshoring, there's a phenomena that has led to really what economists call adverse distributional effects, where exactly the people who are least prepared to transition to new kinds of work are the ones who get out of work due to offshoring. And there's a new paper by David Autor out of MIT, which shows a very interesting correlation between that, namely offshoring and job loss in poor regions, and political polarization. So this is a really striking and important problem, and it is a case that we don't really have a good solution. That basically dislocation is occurring, but we don't have a policy, we don't have a plan for how people, especially the most vulnerable, which are the people who are least educated, will move on to a new kind of work. And I think it's going to become a very pressing problem, to the point where Rachel is absolutely right that this could be a national security issue in terms of the amount of destabilization that it might cause.
Thank you, Malcolm. If we can take the next question, please.
Dear friends, I beg you to listen. I am the founder and president of RoboWatch LLC, www.robowatch.org. And I beg you to listen. And a month ago, I begged the Chicago Council of Global Affairs to listen when they were getting a presentation by Amy Webb, who was talking about the future of work, and she told everyone that she is a robot hybrid because she's had equipment implanted. And she's written a book called Signals, and the idea is that in order to compete with robots and AI, we must become one with them. We must have various chips implanted in our body, and that's what she's doing.
Do you have a question for the panel, please?
I'm begging you to listen, and I'm saying you need to work with me because I have been threatened, and you need to listen to me. I'm asking you to let me talk to you after this.
Well, we barely have time, and the time is allotted for questions, and we have listened to you already, so thank you so much.
I need to listen.
Yeah. Oh, that was easy. The next one, please.
If the architecture and the decision-making processes underlying these AI neural nets or whatever modality they use are largely inscrutable even to the programmers that create them, even if they do provide a verisimilitudinous simulacrum of human behaviors or even superior ones, how can we trust them? How can we examine or otherwise interrogate their so-called thought processes?
We can't. I mean, the problem is that humans make mistakes. When we drive in a car and we are distracted or something happens, the light shines in our eyes, we make mistakes. And the question for us is, when we have training sets, we're using all this data and we're creating algorithms, doing the reverse inspection, being able to look back and say, I want to know exactly, I want to prove to myself that you would never have this outcome. That right now is the same with humans. That's not something we can't do. We can, however, we can do lots of testing. That's what we do with humans. We have pilots exams. We have other types of exams. We have scenario exams. But being able to take an algorithm in the AI sense and prove that we can be sure about how it's going to make a decision, that's not something in our current vocabulary, and maybe Malcolm.
I would just add to that. So there's this cultural breakdown within academics between those who are working on AI and deep neural nets and these sorts of applications, and people I know a bit better, roboticists who believe in provably correct algorithms. And an interesting thing that's happening is that, so provably correct algorithms are, until recently, quite restricted in terms of the complexity of the machine that they could operate. But AI is helping, and there's now a drone which has a provably correct algorithm that runs on it that was partially designed by AI. So AI has helped with getting provably correct code working. So in these cases, which are really essential for safety critical applications, you can do provably correct and trust, therefore, the algorithm contingent on the right assumptions, because there's always lots of assumptions that go into these. But it is very, very, very different from deep neural nets, where post absorption of all the millions of images, you look in the black box and people go, well, I'm not sure why it works, but it sure does work. And that is certainly not provably correct.
And we're not provably correct.
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. So my question is an open-ended question to any of the panelists. When, or better said, if we ever achieve true artificial intelligence, we'll most likely do it through creating it from scratch or uploading a brain into a computer. So bodily function, everything that means to be human corporally, will be lost. So my question to you is the classic AI question. Cognitively, what does it mean to be human?
Christoph, maybe this one's for you.
Yeah, there we go. The theologian can answer that.
Right. I'm going to step out on a limb and say that the line, if you will, in terms of what it means to be human, will probably shift from intelligence to some form of intuition. The ability for us to intuit, if you will, the social world, right? The ability to make certain forms of not just decisions, but forms of discernment that presuppose your knowledge of the world, right? That presuppose social formation. I think that's where we're going to see the line begin to shift. I think part of the challenge of talking about AI is that we often project immediately our human qualities onto whatever this new intelligence will be. And whatever this super intelligence is, right, it will be a machine intelligence. Right? It will not be the same as the embodied consciousness. Right? So I think that's an important distinction, that we don't yet know what this might be, but we certainly will be interacting with another, a qualitatively different kind of intelligence.
And just a quick sobering thought from the philosopher on this panel is that the question of what constitutes something being a human being is always distinguished from what makes a person, as opposed to just a human being. And philosophers do not agree on a single answer. I mean, they're a cantankerous bunch, but in this case, there is genuine disagreement about what qualities must an entity have for it to be a human being or a person.
So this kind of is based off the last two questions. So at what point do like computer scientists that are humans that are programming the AI, like they become useless, or would it become more of a natural science to like work with AI or like study them or make them? If you got that.
I'm not sure what the question is. Could you repeat it?
Like, I mean, at what point do computer scientists that like the ones that program the AI, when would they become useless to like you don't need them anymore to work along with them, or like would AI just become their own like natural science kind of thing?
Self-programming AI.
Yeah.
I think we're a long way from it, but
yeah, maybe thankfully.
Machines have always been very efficient with algorithmic-based problem solving, because, like Rachel said, in certain routine tasks, and you said, in routine tasks, you can take out the emotion part of it, right? But now we have machine learning, which is database learning, statistical learning, right? Where you treat that as learning from experience. So you look at data and you take the feedback and learn from it. So essentially, we're trying to make the machines more and more like us, because we learn from experiences. We are algorithmic, but we also learn from experiences. So there's algorithmic and the database learning. So as machines become more and more like us, because we're trying to make them more and more like us, what is the sense in the community as to if the machines will succumb to the same kind of problems and emotional biases that we have eventually? if we're trying to make them more like us. And the whole point of using machines to take out those emotional aspects and biases, will we have come around a full circle and start at the same problem?
Yeah, so I'll just say very briefly, earlier we talked about this notion that while we can learn, we still want to, with computers, we still believe that's what's necessary, as you point out, is a algorithmic or a ethical or a way to decide and evaluate what is right and wrong. And that we can try with data sets to do some of that, right? But there are real decisions that have to be made, and what we need to do as a society is discuss what should that look like? What kind of the other part of AI, not just the training, right, in this case, but the real decision and value be? And I think this is an evolution for us.
Just on that point, I think the question of values is key. I think it's deeply related to the economic issues that were talked about a little while ago, that how much of our social world do we want governed by the value of efficiency? Yeah. Right? So as efficiency becomes kind of a reigning value over more and more of social life, now we really get into those economic questions about the value of who we are.
Just one quick follow-up, too. I think that question is exactly on point, and I think that a lot of what's going on in robotics right now is how do you deal with noisy sensor data in order to get them to be as interactive with their environments as humans are. And what you see is that they make all the same kinds of errors that humans do because the data is noisy and the sensors are noisy. And so you end up with systems that are fallible just in the manner that you talk about. And then there's a huge source of bias or error in the sense of which Pete was just talking about, where because we have to build in all these things to sort of prioritize data and prioritize sensor readings, that we might make the wrong decision. And I think there's been an incident with, I think it was Google Images recently, that was categorizing black people in a bad way or something. I don't remember all the details, but this is one of these outcomes that happens as you try to sensorize AI and make it as interactive and as responsive to the environment as humans are. We do it with hundreds of millions of sensors, but the data's noisy, the sensor's noisy, and the result is that we have lots of mistakes.
And so maybe just on that point, the way you ask your question, certainly there's a lot that's being built into AI, and a lot of the people creating the code, for example, are male, right? So it's female, you're like, oh, not again, right? Like, here we go. Right? So there's that aspect of it. But, I was talking to someone who was very deep in thinking about using big data and kind of AI learning through it. And they can begin to see patterns. For example, when you control for gender, which isn't a hard thing, it's just we don't do it that often in terms of our healthcare. But it's not that hard to code through and say, can you relearn all these cases that are now, we have access to these huge files, we don't need to see names. Can you relearn some lessons if you include gender in it in terms of what dosage we should be giving, or what indicators might come together and create different sorts of problems? And so there's the one side of it, of the coding, remembering the biases, but there's the other one. We can strip out some of these biases that we build in from being human to actually provide for a kind of a more comfortable or a more extended set of healthcare discussions that we can have.
We are about 4 minutes later than scheduled, but we have time, I think, for one quick question, so go ahead.
So Pete and Malcolm, you made it very clear that our pathetic little mere human brains can't really understand the level of complexity of this. There's no one human being that can even understand a cell phone. It's so complex. But so Rachel, you brought up this thing, we have policymakers who are going to make these decisions, these judgment calls around it. Do we need to somehow re-choose who are making the decisions around this to be those who truly understand this at a deeper level? which maybe they never can? Or do we only allow the policy making to happen at the level of, this is what we think the consequences of AI are, and then therefore we will make policy around that?
So the good news in Illinois is actually we have for our representatives, we actually do have leaders who are deeply involved in working on some of these issues. I mean, it's obviously a broader question, but here's what, as the voting, this question comes up because I do a lot of talks on nuclear weapons, like what can we do? Climate change, what can we do? Artificial intelligence, what can we do? And here's what we can do. We're all sitting here having this conversation. When our policymakers are in front of us, we can ask them, what are the issues, what are you doing about this? What are the issues that are coming up, and what decisions are you making on this? And so I'm going to just flip to climate change for a second. I promise to come back to AI, but the question isn't do you believe in climate change or not, is what are you doing right now in terms of policies that you're making around the climate, and then we can make those decisions of whether we want those policymakers. But if we're not asking that, if all we want is to kind of have a beer with our decision makers, well, we're going to get that, and that seems to be where, but if we can have these conversations and think about what questions do we ask of our policymakers, we can begin to make sure they put it on their radar screen, because they, we hear it time and time again, is if their voters here in the U.S., it's different elsewhere, aren't asking for our policymakers to put something on the agenda, even if they want to, they can't. And so it's up to all of us, and that's why maybe it's an appropriate way, you know, kudos to SAIC and Illinois Humanities for deciding that this was worth it, and the fact that it fills the room. I think we all have a lot of questions, so it's a hard question to answer, especially at this political moment, but I think we have a lot of demanding of our policymakers in front of us.
Even regular intelligence would be a good.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you panelists. Have a good evening.